Fill your summer with the sun-kissed sweetness of Amigos Refreshers. There's strawberry acai, blueberry dragon fruit, and mango passion fruit, each a tropical delight. So skip the hot coffee and amp up your day with the plant-based natural caffeine and fruity flavor fusions in an Amigos Refresher. These cool thirst quenchers are just $3.99, or there's a mega 32-ounce size for $4.99. Recharge with the bold, fresh flavor of an energizing refresher at Amigos.
Find easy ways to store your outdoor tools and accessories at Menards. Suncast provides high quality and easy to assemble storage. Suncast storage sheds are the perfect solution for organizing and protecting your outdoor tools and equipment. Plus, their all-weather construction is low maintenance. Explore all our outdoor storage options in store and on Menards.com. And check out more of our great deals going on now at Menards.
Save big money at Menards.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and in this episode, I will be covering our final Miss Marple story. It is time to talk about Sanctuary by Agatha Christie. I have been dreading this day, but I refuse to mope on this episode. It is always a cause for celebration to have Miss Marple in our lives, so let's celebrate this final story properly. I actually have another cause for celebration I wanted to share with you all up top. I believe I've only mentioned this once before, but I wrote a mystery novel myself not too long ago, and that novel will be published in January of 2024, which is still a long ways off. However, everything in the book world happens months ahead of time, and I'm so excited to be able to tell you that you can now pre-order my book. I've included some links for pre-ordering in the notes to this episode. For now, the only links I was able to find were for Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but as soon as I have a working link for Bookshop and other indie outlets, I will absolutely include them as well. The name of the book is The Busybody, and it's a traditional puzzle mystery a la Agatha Christie. You're all shocked, I'm sure. I believe I talked about this a little bit with Linda Brobeck, the mother of my departed and much missed, eternally missed, former co-host Catherine Brobeck. I think Linda and I touched on this in our Curtain episode together, but this novel that I wrote is a direct result of the work that I've been doing for the last 6+ years on this podcast. The joy and the passion that I was able to access by way of reading Agatha Christie and sharing that joy and passion with Catherine and with all of you. So I really do think of this book as our project, mine and all of yours. It has a contemporary setting. There's lots of humor in it. My aim was to create something entertaining and diverting for all of you. If you are a longtime listener of this podcast, I think you'll definitely have a leg up on solving the mystery. I will just leave it at that. So I really hope you'll all check it out. And pre-ordering a book is so helpful. There are so many books out there, so many mysteries published every day, and pre-orders will make a book stand out. So for any of you who do click on those links and pre-order my novel, please know I am extremely grateful. All right, back to our episode now. First, I would like to take care of some housekeeping. I actually have quite a few matters of housekeeping here, a rather large mailbag to contend with, stuffed with all sorts of goodies. I'm going to go in reverse chronological order, starting with my most recent episode in which I discussed some adaptations and texts that Catherine and I had missed the first time around. This is a really embarrassing error that I made in that episode. So embarrassing that I actually spliced in a correction soon after publishing the episode. So you may have already heard me make this correction on the episode if you happened to listen to it after I had spliced in my correction. Or if you are an avid listener and you download and listen to these episodes immediately upon publishing, you may not have heard this. So I just want to read out the very short and very sweet email message I got from one of you listeners after posting that episode. Hi, Kemper. I do hope you and your family are well. Really enjoyed the All About Agatha episode, but it is Austin Trevor, not Trevor Austin. That's right. Throughout my most recent episode, when I was talking about the film adaptation of Lord Edgware Dies, I referred to the actor Austin Trevor, who plays Poirot in that film, who played him in 3 films in the 1930s. I referred to him as Trevor Austin, but his name is Austin Trevor. Very embarrassing, but these are the sorts of misstatements one makes from time to time when one does a podcast. Mea culpa, and thank you to that listener for telling me so quickly. It was sort of the literary podcast equivalent of someone telling you your fly is down or you have something up your nose discreetly and quickly. And I fixed it up right quick. But I wanted to make sure that all of you were aware of that error in case you missed it when you were listening to the episode. All right, next up, we have some emails about the staining properties of blackberries. You did not disappoint me when I was covering 4 and 20 Blackbirds, which was the final Poirot short story I covered on this podcast. A major plot point hinges on the fact that blackberries apparently stain one's teeth black, or at least significantly purple. And the fact that this stain was missing from one set of teeth is very significant. I won't get more specific than that. I don't want to spoil 4 and 20 Blackbirds for anyone. Take a listen to the episode if you're not sure what I'm talking about here. And I felt that Christie was overdoing the staining properties of blackberries in this story. I wasn't really convinced that blackberries would stain one's teeth as much as she seems to think they do. And I asked all of you to write in if you had any knowledge to share on the issue. And I knew you wouldn't disappoint me, and indeed you did not. So here's what one of you wrote. Hello, Kemper. My husband and I were listening to the episode where Barry's staining teeth was a clue. We think it might have been like ices/water ice are today. They stain your mouth for a while. Side note, but this is very true. I recently ate a cherry icy at the Los Angeles Zoo and was shocked and horrified by how red it made my tongue. Back to the email. We also think the addition of fluoride to our diets may have made our teeth more stain resistant in modern America. If it prevents cavities, how does it do that? Perhaps by hardening the surface? Would that mean that in the past more foods stained teeth? And then this listener addresses another point that I covered in the 4 and 20 Blackbirds episode. As a teacher of British literature, my teen students and I are already calling HMTQ the old queen. Charles is the new king. We make analogies to Queen Elizabeth and King James when studying Shakespeare. I love your podcast and Miss Catherine. I'm so pleased whenever a new episode appears. Thank you for that lovely message, listener. And yes, I had mentioned that in the Suchet adaptation of 4 and 20 Blackbirds, there's mention made of the old queen, which is a reference to Queen Victoria. And I was wondering if people would start doing that in reference to Queen Elizabeth II. And it sounds like that is already happening. I love it. I also did a quick Google search after getting this message about how fluoride works. And it does seem that fluoride hardens the enamel coating of teeth. I have not fact-checked this whatsoever with a dentist, so take that with the proverbial grain of salt. But I think this listener is on to something. But it wasn't only this listener who wrote in about the staining properties of blackberries. Oh no, I heard from another listener as well. Hi, Kemper. I haven't emailed before, have briefly chatted on Patreon, but just listened to the 4 and 20 Blackbirds episode, and for once, I have some obscure knowledge to add to the discussion. The clue about the stained/not stained teeth from the blackberry pudding that you were querying had me desperate to butt in. My main job is working as an archaeobotanist. I identify ancient plant remains for a living, and one of the extra things I've done in my time is look at plant remains in the stomach contents of murder victims to help with last meals, etc. Sorry, should have warned this would be disgusting. The pathologist in 4 and 20 Blackbirds obviously looked at the victim's stomach contents because he gave an approximate time of death from the last meal. If the deceased had eaten blackberry pudding, his stomach contents would have contained very obvious blackberry seeds, as well as probably being very purple. Blackberry seeds are really robust and can withstand digestion unscathed. I've identified blackberry seeds from Roman latrine deposits, so there would be no problem in seeing them in stomach contents that were a few days old. It would be extremely unlikely for there to be no blackberry seeds present in the stomach/gut if blackberries had been eaten in the last few hours before death. This would be a much better determinant of consumption/non-consumption than stained teeth. I love that. That is really fascinating. And I did not think that I would be thinking about ancient Roman latrine deposits, but I love that I am right now. I also feel like this is a little bit of a vindication for the analysis of stomach contents in murder cases. I remember that when my good friend Carla Valentine was on the podcast for her book, Murder Isn't Easy, The Forensics of Agatha Christie, she talked about how the digestion of stomach contents can't really be used to pin down the time of death because digestion is all over the place, especially when one is being murdered, i.e. your body is in great distress. So the normal processes of digestion, which a scientist might know beforehand, just sort of go out the window when one is analyzing what's happened in the body of a murder victim. And that makes a lot of sense to me. But in this case specifically, because we are dealing with blackberries that are so easily visible, it's a really good point that the color and seediness of the stomach contents would be quite significant here. So thank you to both of those listeners for those Blackberry-themed emails. I really enjoyed them, but that was not my final email about 4 and 20 blackbirds. Another one of you wrote as follows. I enjoyed your recent podcast about 4 and 20 blackbirds, as I do all your podcasts. I was surprised, however, that you were unfamiliar with the artist Augustus John, who was referenced. I was mainly surprised because I've always understood him to be the real-life artist on which the character Ammius Crail was consciously or unconsciously based, the murder victim in your number one novel, Five Little Pigs. I totally agree with your choice as number one, by the way. I thought that some Christie scholars have referred to this in the past. Augustus John was a similar personality to Crail, larger than life, brash, focused only on his art at all costs, and something of a philanderer. Personally, I prefer the art of his sister, Gwen John, who was always overshadowed by her brother, and also by her lover, Rodin. Wow, I had no idea about any of this. It makes a lot of sense to me, though, that Augustus John would be an inspiration for Ammius Crail, the lusty, life-filled Ammius Crail. So thank you for that, listener. I will always now think of Augustus John when I reread Five Little Pigs. Now, another of you listeners wrote to me in response to the interview I did with mystery author Kitty Murphy. In our discussion, Kitty and I were talking about words that members of the LGBTQ community might potentially find harmful and the way she chose to use or really not use those words in her own text. And I mentioned the fact that I had recently read a Christiana Brand novel, Green for Danger, where the word pansy was used. And it made me reflect on the fact that this word, pansy, is not one that we come across very often in Agatha Christie. And I actually couldn't think of any instance in which the word was used off the top of my head. I am pleased to say that one of you wrote in with textual proof of one such instance. Here is what this listener wrote to me. On the episode with Kitty Murphy, the word pansy came up, and I think you both wondered if it had ever occurred in Christie. Well, yes. I came across it just after hearing that episode, and now I finally got around to writing to you about it. It's in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, 1952. Ariadne Oliver is working with a playwright to adapt Sven Hirsen for the stage. It's not going well. The playwright suggests making her Finnish detective younger and in love with a girl, saying the feeling of sex antagonism will pep the whole thing up enormously. Sven Hirsen never cared for women, said Mrs. Oliver coldly. But you can't have him a pansy, darling. Not for this sort of play. I mean, it's not Green Bay Trees or anything like that. It's thrills and murders and clean open-air fun. And this listener goes on to write, I love this. I can always appreciate questionable words and attitudes being placed in the mouths of exactly the right character. And I agree, this is an instance where Christie is placing that word in the mouth of a fairly obnoxious character. And I knew that word had to crop up somewhere among these 66 books of Christie's. I'm sure it appears elsewhere as well. If you know of any other such instance, please give me a shout at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. I so love getting all of these emails, as I think you can probably tell. I only have 2 more emails to share, both of which relate directly to the story we are about to discuss. Here's the first email. I hope you are doing well. I was rereading A Murder is Announced to distract me from the awfulness in Tennessee's legislature and elsewhere. I came across this passage that I wanted to ask about. I don't think this came up during the episode on the book, but it's been a while since I listened to it. And now the listener is quoting from Christie's text. Bunch's father, he was vicar of our parish, a very fine scholar, and her mother, who is a most remarkable woman, real spiritual power, are very old friends of mine. End quote. And now the listener continues. This is Miss Marple explaining why her presence in the village is natural. Is she describing the Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrop from The Moving Finger? Are they Bunch's parents? It would make sense since Bunch is a bit eccentric, but also very smart in her own way. I don't know if it has ever come up in your talks with other Christie scholars, but if you've heard anything, please let me know. And then nearly simultaneously, I received this second message from another listener. Here's what they had to say. I started rereading the books with greater attention to detail, and this observation from a murder as announced struck me. Miss Marple, in speaking of Bunch Harmon, states that her, quote, father was rector of our parish, a very fine scholar, and her mother, who is a most remarkable woman, a real spiritual power, are very old friends of mine, end quote. Is it at all possible that Bunch Harmon is the daughter of the Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrop? The descriptions sound very much like the characters as portrayed in The Moving Finger. Just a thought. Check out that synchronicity. Clearly, Bunch Harmon was in the ether because Bunch is very much featured in the short story Sanctuary. I love this theory. I'm not 100% convinced by it because The Moving Finger takes place not in St. Mary Mead, but in Limstock. Mrs. Dane Calthrop invites Miss Marple to Limstock to help figure out what is happening with the poison pen letters in that town in The Moving Finger. So I'm not sure that we have proof that the Reverend Dane Calthrop was ever rector of Miss Marple's parish in St. Mary Mead. However, in support of these listeners' theory, I will note that the Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrop also appear in The Pale Horse. In that novel, they are situated in the town of Much Deeping, which is where a great deal of the action of that mystery takes place. So it seems as if the Dane Calthrops get around. So I think it is eminently possible, if not probable, that at some point the Reverend Dane Calthrop was the rector of Miss Marple's parish, and that is how she came to know them well enough that Mrs. Dane Calthrop would call upon her as she does in The Moving Finger. So you know what? Let's just go ahead and say yes. Bunch Harmon is the daughter of the Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrop. I like it. We're going a little rogue here, a little out on a limb. And if anyone disagrees with me or has anything to add about this conspiracy theory, please, please, please write me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. I would love to hear it. I will be happy to feature you in a future episode. Our housekeeping is now sorted. Our mailbag has been depleted. And I would like to turn now to Sanctuary by Agatha Christie. First of all, I think this is a great title. It's arresting and it's very much on point, as we'll soon see. Per my good friend, Dr. John Curran, there was an alternate title for this story, which was Aftermath. I think Sanctuary is the much better choice. Let's talk now about publication history for this story because it's a bit of an unusual one. I am thrilled to report. I'm going to get to dwell on publication history for a little bit here. So this story was written in January 1954, which is very late for an Agatha Christie short story. And it was then published in October of the same year, in 1954. And it was written for a very specific reason. Christie actually mentions this in her autobiography. She mentions the short story by name because she did not write this to make money for herself, which was the reason she wrote most of her stories. She wrote this as a way of contributing to the Fund for the Restoration of Westminster Abbey. So what that means is that the serialization fee for this story in the UK went not to Christie personally, but to this fund for the restoration of Westminster Abbey. I imagine Westminster Abbey has all sorts of restoration projects going on pretty much all the time. Perhaps there was a big restoration push in the mid-1950s. Westminster Abbey is very big. It's very old. There's a lot to restore. Incidentally, I could not resist publishing this episode on the very day that so many of us are seeing a whole lot of Westminster Abbey, much more than we normally do. Yes, the coronation of King Charles III is taking place at Westminster Abbey on the very day that this episode publishes. I just talked about synchronicity. Geez. Apparently, this is the podcast's Westminster Abbey episode. So magazines in the UK were able to bid on the story, and the highest bidder got the serialization rights. It was Woman's Journal who won out, and apparently the magazine refused to state how much they paid. They just noted that the amount was considerable. So that takes care of the UK serialization. In the US, it was serialized in This Week magazine in 2 installments on the 12th and 19th of September in 1954 under the title Murder at the Vicarage. Because that's not confusing, is it? Especially since the murder here definitely did not take place at a vicarage. Boo, badly handled. Also, I just have to mention this. I learned this from Christie biographer Janet Morgan, but the fact that this fund to restore Westminster Abbey was the recipient of the UK serialization fee meant that there was a complication with, you guessed it, taxes. As usual, this had to do with American taxes and a tax exemption that the UK entity that owned serial rights had to sign, except that the Save the Abbey Fund didn't pay taxes. I imagine that's because they had a religious exemption. Christie's UK agent, Edmund Cork, complained about this to her US agent, Harold Ober, but somehow they figured it out. I also just have to say that all this business surrounding the restoration of Westminster Abbey reminds me of the motivation behind the Greenshore Folly, which Christie wrote the same year that she wrote Sanctuary. Listeners may remember that the Greenshore Folly was a novella that she later turned into Dead Man's Folly. But initially, she wrote the novella, The Greenshore Folly, to help raise funds to install stained glass windows in the chancel of Churston Ferrers Church, which was her local church. So I have to wonder if she was inspired by the fund that had been set up for the restoration of Westminster Abbey, which she'd contributed to with Sanctuary, and thought to set up her own fund for her own modest neighborhood church. It seems pretty likely to me, but I'm not basing that on any evidence whatsoever, just to be clear. It was just 1 month after Sanctuary was first published in October of 1954 that Edmund Cork wrote to the board responsible for the upkeep of this local church. He wrote to them in November of 1954. So I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see a connection between these two endeavors. If you'll remember, Christie actually wasn't able to sell the serialization rights to the novella, The Greenshore Folly, because it was such an awkward length. It was too long for the magazines. So she had to write a different story, Greenshaw's Folly. Apparently, the title had to be similar for legal reasons, and the proceeds from the sale of Greenshaw's Folly were used to pay for those stained glass windows in her local church. Greenshaw's Folly, of course, is another Miss Marple short story. And for this reason, I can't help muddling Greenshaw's Folly, which was written to fund stained glass windows, with Sanctuary, which features stained glass windows in a church so prominently. Anyway, this short story was first published in book form in the UK all the way in 1979. After Christie had passed away, in the short story collection, Miss Marple's Final Cases. I'll just note that 2 of the 8 short stories in that collection are not Miss Marple short stories. Those would be The Dressmaker's Doll, which was covered many, many moons ago on this podcast, and In a Glass Darkly, which I have yet to cover on this podcast, but cover it I shall. So all is not lost, dear listeners. Even though this is the final Miss Marple story I'll be covering on the podcast, we have more Christie material to come. And then in the US, this story was first published in book form in 1961 in the short story collection Double Sin and Other Stories. All right, let's talk about our victim. Unfortunately, we're not quite sure what his name is for most of this story, so I'm not going to supply you with a name, but he is a man who was found dying on the altar of the church in good old Chipping Cleghorn, the town we last visited in A Murder is Announced, which was published in 1950, just 4 years before Christie wrote this story. It turns out this man has been shot, and he dies of internal bleeding. Let's talk suspects. Our first suspect isn't really a suspect, but she is the woman who finds our victim, and she is none other than Bunch Harmon, the wife of Julian Harmon, vicar of Chipping Cleghorn, and daughter of the Reverend and Mrs. Dane Calthrop. Bunch is a family name, of course. Christie writes in this story that she was christened Diana, quote, by her optimistic parents, end quote. I'm not exactly sure which of Diana's traits Christie is alluding to here. Her beauty, her chastity, her athleticism, all the above. Anyway, poor little Diana was nicknamed Bunch at an early age for somewhat obvious reasons. And the name stuck. I love it, and I love Bunch. And since we mentioned Bunch as a suspect, let's go ahead and throw suspicion on Bunch's Leonard Clement-esque husband, the good vicar Julian Harmon, who remains as passionate about antiquity as he was in A Murder is Announced. Julian Harmon is a dweeb, but he too is lovely. And now for some real suspects. We've got Mr. and Mrs. Eccles, who really do come as a pair. Mrs. Eccles is the dead man's sister, or so she claims. The Eccleses come to visit Bunch to collect their dear brother's things. Mr. Eccles is described as a stout, florid man whose natural manner would have been cheerful and facetious if he weren't visiting the woman who witnessed his brother-in-law's death. And Mrs. Eccles is described as having a vaguely flashy look about her. She had a small, mean, pursed-up mouth. Her voice was thin and reedy. Sounds suspicious, doesn't she? And then our final suspect comes in rather late in the story, but he is a man named Edwin Moss, and he is described as follows: tall, dark, and well-dressed with a drawling voice and a superior manner. Could be trouble. We shall see as we enter the world as it appears to be. Bunch Harmon is arranging flowers she's picked from the vicarage over in the church next door to the vicarage. The church is cold since it's cloudy outside and the church is unheated other than at service times. So she gets on with arranging these flowers in a pleasant but by no means artistic manner and is stepping up the aisle to make her way toward the altar when the sun comes out suddenly. Christie writes, "It shone through the east window of somewhat crude colored glass, mostly blue and red, the gift of a wealthy Victorian churchgoer." Uh-oh, sounds like some Victorian ruinovation has been happening to the church at Chipping Cleghorn. Back to Christie. The effect was almost startling in its sudden opulence. Like jewels, thought Bunch. Suddenly she stopped, staring ahead of her. On the chancel steps was a huddled, dark form. And this dark form is our victim, who is already close to death. He's got a feeble pulse, a greenish pallor, and a hand clenched over his breast, which is holding a large wad of paper or a handkerchief. And there are splashes of a brown fluid around his hand, which Bunch guesses is dried blood. It's all very dramatic, especially for a Miss Marple short story. And my good friend, Dr. John Curran, notes that the sun pouring through that stained glass is reminiscent of those motley colored tableaux in the Mysterious Mr. Quinn series. Sigh, I miss Mr. Quinn and Mr. Satterthwaite. But on with Bunch. The man is almost too weak to speak, but he manages to say a single word to her. Sanctuary. He even says it again, so there's no mistaking the word. Bunch tells him not to move, or even try to move. She says she's going for help. And then the man seems to focus on the colored light coming through that stained glass window, and he murmurs something Bunch can't catch, but it almost sounds like her husband's first name, Julian. So Bunch quickly fetches the local doctor, a Dr. Griffiths, who has the man moved into the vicarage and who calls for an ambulance and also notifies the police. The doctor tells Bunch that by the time the ambulance comes, this poor man will have died from internal bleeding. Bunch thinks that he was probably in the church overnight. The church is unlocked in the morning, but the man who does so doesn't usually come in. So this poor bleeding man could have been there for hours and hours. Dr. Griffiths says that the man must have been shot at fairly close range. The man used a handkerchief to plug up the wound and try to stop it from bleeding. Bunch asks if he could have gotten far after being shot, and Dr. Griffiths says yes. Quoting now from the text, "A mortally wounded man has been known to pick himself up and walk along a street as though nothing had happened, and then suddenly collapse 5 or 10 minutes later." So they don't really know where this man came from or how he got to the church. The vicar then enters. Christie writes that his vague, scholarly manner always made him appear much older than he really was. Leonard Clement all over again. And Julian just says, "Dear me." When Bunch asks if her husband knows the man, since he might have said Julian's name, the vicar says he's almost sure he's never seen him before. And at that point, the dying man's eyes open and he stares into Bunch's face saying, "Please, please." And then he dies. Which I think shows some real restraint on Christie's part, not adding some sort of cryptic phrase or expression here. We cut from this rather affecting scene to a Sergeant Hayes, who is interviewing Bunch. Personally, I wish it could have been D.S. Fletcher from A Murder is Announced. Maybe he got transferred in the interim or promoted. Anyway, we find out that in the dead man's pockets were a wallet, a rather battered old watch with the initials W.S., and the return half of a ticket to London. Nothing more. And by this point, a Mr. and Mrs. Eccles have phoned the station to say that the man in question was Mrs. Eccles's brother, William Sanborn. Per Sergeant Hayes, who either spoke directly to the Eccleses or was briefed on what they said, been in a low state of health and nerves for some time. He's been getting worse lately. The day before yesterday, he walked out and didn't come back. He took a revolver with him. So it seems that poor William Sanborn died by suicide. But Bunch is confused. Why would he choose to leave London, come all the way out to Chipping Cleghorn, and die in the church there? No sooner does Sergeant Hayes tell Bunch she may receive a call from the Eccleses than the Eccleses appear. And from the moment she sees this couple, Bunch feels that something is off with them. They have a pretty conventional conversation about how sad it all is, how Brother Bill was feeling down, etc. It's obvious that Bunch is pretty repulsed by them. And then, just as they're about to leave, they ask whether Bunch has the dead man's coat. And she realizes she actually does. She and the doctor took off the man's coat when they were examining him, and she must have taken it upstairs with the towels and basin they were using. So she goes upstairs, and she takes rather a long time finding this coat. When she returns with it, she apologizes, saying, "My daily woman must have put it aside with other clothes that were going to the cleaners. It's taken me quite a long time to find it." So the Eccleses leave, and then Bunch goes to Julian and asks him what sanctuary actually means. True to type, Julian gives a very learned, very verbose answer having to do with Roman and Greek temples, stuff happening in 399 AD, the 7th century King Ethelbert of Kent gets a mention, etc., etc. Bunch's response to all of this is to kiss him on the nose. Christie writes, Julian felt rather like a dog who has been congratulated on performing a clever trick. Bunch says she's heading to London for a special white sale at Burroughs and Portman's. At first, Julian thinks she's referring to the sails of a ship. Oh, Julian. Bunch clarifies, sheets, tablecloths, and towels and glass cloths. I don't know what we do with our glass cloths, the way they wear through. Besides, she added thoughtfully, I think I ought to go and see Aunt Jane. Ladies and gentlemen, for the last time, enter Miss Jane Marple. So Aunt Jane, who is referred to as that sweet old lady, which makes me long yet again for my former partner, Catherine Brobeck, because Catherine would have had such a good chuckle at that. Aunt Jane, that sweet old lady. Miss Marple has been, quote, enjoying the delights of the metropolis for a fortnight at this point, living in her dear nephew Raymond's flat, while he and his wife, Joan, née Joyce, are traveling in America. So Bunch visits Miss Marple at this flat. Miss Marple is her godmother, and these two are very close, as we saw in A Murder is Announced. And she fills Miss Marple in on everything that's happened, and she says that it just doesn't make sense. It's all wrong, said Bunch. The man who was there in the church, dying, knew all about sanctuary. He said it just the way Julian would have said it. I mean, he was a well-read, educated man, and if he'd shot himself, he wouldn't drag himself to a church afterwards and say sanctuary. Sanctuary means that you're pursued, and when you get into a church, you're safe. Your pursuers can't touch you. At one time, even the law couldn't get at you. And indeed, this is curious. It doesn't make sense. But then Bunch gives Miss Marple some new information. Apparently, the dead man's watch, which have the initials WS on it, also has an inscription on the inside that reads, to Walter from his father. Now, why would Walter's sister call him William if his name was Walter? As Bunch says, I know you're not always called the name you're baptized by. I mean, I can understand that you might be christened William and called Porgy or Carrots or something, but your sister wouldn't call you William or Bill if your name was Walter. I think Bunch is right here. She is, after all, uniquely qualified to expound on the way nicknames work. Bunch is sure that Mrs. Eccles is not the dead man's sister. And furthermore, she's convinced that Mr. Eccles is the one who shot him. She thinks that this man was murdered, and this is why she went to Miss Marple, as one does, because Miss Marple solves murders. And Miss Marple immediately asks one of the same questions Bunch did, which is, why Chipping Cleghorn? Even if this man wanted sanctuary in a church for some reason, it could have been a church anywhere. Miss Marple asks if the man said a name, and Bunch mentions when he said something that sounded like Julian or maybe Julia. And then Bunch says, as far as I know, there isn't any Julia living in Chipping Cleghorn. Fast forward a minute if you haven't yet read A Murder is Announced, but what about Julia Simmons, Bunch? Though, to be fair, Julia Simmons is unmasked at the end of A Murder is Announced as actually being Emma Stamfordis of Pip and Emma fame. And that is now the second episode in a row in which I got to reference Pip and Emma. That means I must win a prize of some sort. Anyway, Bunch then lets drop the biggest and best new piece of information. Remember when she took a long time to retrieve the dead man's coat? Well, turns out the crafty Bunch was scouring this coat for anything that might be hidden in it, since she was already wise to the scamming Eccleses. As Miss Marple says, and we know Miss Marple does not praise her fellow man indiscriminately, you have a lot of common sense, Bunch, and you're very intelligent. I would say that Bunch is practically Miss Marple-esque here, because she's very much rewarded for her efforts. So what she did while the Eccleses were waiting downstairs was to unpick this thread and find a little piece of paper inside. And then she sewed the area back up with thread that matched, and she thinks the Eccleses have no idea what she did. So what was on that paper? Well, it was a cloakroom ticket for Paddington Station. And let's remember that the dead man had a return ticket to London in his pocket. What station was this returned for? That's right, we are going to Paddington Station. But first, Miss Marple makes a cryptic remark about not needing the old speckled tweed with the beaver collar just at present. Let's note that. Also, before they go to Paddington Station, they attend that White Cell because that's what Bunch said she was going to do up in London. And Miss Marple is worried that someone might be following her. So they go to that White Cell, and this is where we get probably my favorite passage in the entire story. It was about an hour and a half later that the two ladies, rather the worse for wear and battered in appearance, and both clasping parcels of hardly won household linen, sat down at a small and sequestered hostelry called the Apple Bough to restore their forces with steak and kidney pudding, followed by apple tart and custard. Really a pre-war quality face towel, gasped Miss Marple, slightly out of breath. With a J on it, too. So fortunate that Raymond's wife's name is Joan, or Joyce. I shall put them aside until I really need them, and then they will do for her if I pass on sooner than I expect. I really did need the glass cloths, said Bunch, and they were very cheap, though not as cheap as the ones that woman with the ginger hair managed to snatch from me. Oh, this is so delightful. I am in Miss Marple heaven here. Just after this exchange, a smart young woman with a lavish application of rouge and lipstick enters the Apple Bough, and she delivers an envelope to Miss Marple. This young woman is Gladys, one of Miss Marple's army of former maids who she's amassed over the years, a legion of diligent and dedicated young women who would do anything for their former employer and mentor. As Gladys puts it, always pleased to oblige, I'm sure. Ernie always says to me, everything what's good you learn from that Miss Marple of yours that you were in service with, and I'm sure I'm always glad to oblige you, miss. Now, I'd like to pause for a moment and lead you by the arm to the edge of a little rabbit hole that we can jump down together now. Whee! Do you feel the wind whipping through your hair? So Gladys is a name that pops up very often in Christie because she liked to use it for servants or other working class women in her stories. Probably the most famous Gladys within the Christie oeuvre is Gladys Martin, who had appeared just 1 year earlier in A Pocketful of Rye. She is a former maid of Miss Marple's, whose death Miss Marple is determined to avenge. I think it's interesting, actually, that Christie chose to reuse the name Gladys for another of Miss Marple's maids in this story. We know that she started writing this story soon after the publication of A Pocketful of Rye, when the memory of Gladys Martin would have been fresh in both her and her readers' minds. I think it proves that she used this name because it was such a common one for women of the servant class, or at least it was perceived to be a common name. And for this reason, I think it just felt right to her. So we know that this Gladys cannot be Gladys Martin. Personally, I like to think she's Gladys Holmes, one of three maids featured in the Miss Marple short story, The Case of the Perfect Maid. And Gladys is not the seemingly perfect one, by the way. Gladys does not work for Miss Marple in this short story, but Miss Marple is called on to defend her reputation when Gladys is let go by her employers for a spurious reason. It's Miss Marple's own maid, Edna, who makes the request, since Edna and Gladys are cousins. I love the idea of Gladys Holmes working for Miss Marple after this and paying back her debt from the case of the perfect maid with her small contribution in this story. So that's my conspiracy theory, but there really are so many other Gladyses in the oeuvre. I may have shouted out this website before, but even if I did, it's worth a second mention. If you go to agathachristie.fandom.com, which is a huge repository of Christie facts and trivia, it's basically a Christie wiki. If you go there and you put Gladys in the search field, you come up with a ton of entries spanning the Marple verse, the Poirot verse, even the Beresford verse. The Beresverse? That might work better. They even have an entry on the All About Agatha podcast over at this site. And according to them, the Gladys in this story is a separate Gladys. And I have to admit, despite my fun conspiracy theory, I do think that's probably right. Christie simply couldn't use the name Gladys too many times. Okay, let's crawl our way up and out of this rabbit hole and return to the action of Sanctuary. Bunch heads off to Paddington Station at long last, where she produces her ticket and gets a rather shabby old suitcase in return for it. The journey back to Chipping Cleghorn is uneventful, but alas, Bunch has just left her carriage when a man sprints along the platform and wrenches the suitcase out of her grip. Bunch yells at the ticket collector to stop the man, but the man brushes past the collector, making his way toward a waiting car inside of which there is a woman we cannot see. Fortunately, a police constable, Abel, is around, and he is able to stop the man before the car can drive away. This man claims that this is his suitcase, and Bunch, of course, says it's hers. Constable Abel didn't see the man seize the suitcase, so he applies the reasonable solution of asking each of them what is in the suitcase. He's very fair about this, despite the fact that he and Bunch know each other very well. Christie adds this great little detail. Nobody would have guessed that Police Constable Abel and Mrs. Harmon spent long half hours in Police Constable Abel's off time discussing the respective merits of manure and bone meal for rose bushes. So when Constable Abel asks each of them what is in the suitcase, Bunch says, clothes, a long speckled coat with a beaver collar, 2 wool jumpers, and a pair of shoes. The man, whose name is Edwin Moss, says he's a theater costumer and that the suitcase has theatrical properties which I brought down here for an amateur performance. Which strikes me as a rather vague description. Shouldn't Constable Abel have asked some follow-up questions? Like, what kind of props? But it doesn't really matter because once the suitcase is opened, it contains exactly what Bunch says it will. Bunch wins, and Edwin Moss apologizes handsomely, hightailing it out of there along with the unseen woman who has been sitting in the car this whole time. Bunch wonders why Constable Abel is letting the man get away, but Abel assures her that he's being followed. Actually, what he says is, that old lady's been on the phone, the one as was down here a few years ago. Bright she is, isn't she? But there's been a lot cooking up all today. Shouldn't wonder if the inspector or sergeant was out to see you about it tomorrow morning. And indeed, it is Inspector Craddock who shows up. We first met him in A Murder is Announced, and we would go on to see him in 450 from Paddington and The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, both of which novels came out after this short story. Miss Marple actually also references him in A Caribbean Mystery, even though he doesn't actually appear in the book. He's one of her favorites, for sure. And Inspector Craddock hasn't forgotten what went down at Little Paddocks in A Murder is Announced. Crime in Chipping Cleghorn again, is what he says to Bunch, and he says it, quote, cheerfully. You don't lack for sensation here, do you, Mrs. Harmon? So before Inspector Craddock explains all, I have one measly clue here, listeners. Alas, this is not a puzzle mystery. It's certainly not the Poirotian kind that tends to rely on more external clues, or even the Miss Marple kind that tends to rely on insights into human nature. We are not given all the tools to solve this one on our own, but we are given one clue. And that clue is that reference to jewels. Bunch thinks that the lights coming through the stained glass window in the church resemble jewels, and the word jewels is repeated 2 more times in the first part of the story, once by Miss Marple, who says this word thoughtfully. So the deduction is that you'd better believe real, actual, literal jewels are going to figure into this story somehow. That's right, we've got an Agatha Christie jewel heist on our hands here, listeners. Rejoice or repent, depending on how you feel about jewel heists in Christie stories. I know not all of you are fans, and that's fair enough. But could it be possible that jewels here have a double significance? We shall see as we enter the world as it actually is Inspector Craddock confirms Bunch's suspicion about the Eccleses. They seem to have been connected to several robberies in that part of the world. And while Mrs. Eccles does have a brother named Sanborn, the man who Bunch found dying in her village church was named Walter St. John. There's a possibility I'm supposed to pronounce that St. John, but I believe it's only pronounced that way when it's a Christian or first name, as in Jane Eyre. I'm sure someone will let me know if I'm wrong about that. So we finally know our victim's name, Walter St. John. And then Inspector Craddock settles in to tell Bunch a story. A story about a dancer who went by the name Zobeida and who, quote, specialized in an Arabian night turn, Aladdin in the Cave of Jewels, end quote. I'm sure that dance wasn't problematic at all. Yikes, yikes, yikes. Apparently, Zobeida wore bits of rhinestone and not much else for this dance. I'm imagining Gypsy Rose Lee here because, of course I am. That is my main reference for female striptease acts, and I am proud of it. Anyway, apparently a certain Asiatic royalty, those are Christie's words, fell hard for Zobeida and gave her a very magnificent emerald necklace. This royal personage soon moved on from Zobeida, but the dancer held on to the necklace. Unfortunately for her, the necklace was subsequently stolen. As Inspector Craddock explains, it disappeared from the dressing room at the theater, and there was a lingering suspicion in the minds of the authorities that she herself might have engineered its disappearance. Craddock continues, the necklace was never recovered, but during the course of the investigation, the attention of the police was drawn to this man, Walter St. John. And Walter was educated and well-bred, but he had come down in the world. He was employed as a jeweler with a firm that was suspected of acting as a fence for jewel robberies, and it was actually in connection with another theft that he had gone to jail. And Walter had escaped from jail quite recently before he was found dead in Chipping Cleghorn. As far as the authorities can tell, when he did escape, he visited an old woman named Mrs. Jacobs, who'd been a theatrical dresser, and who wasn't telling the police anything. She won't say a word to them. Walter left Mrs. Jacobs's place carrying a suitcase, and the two men named Mr. Eccles and Mr. Moss trailed him. Craddock believes they followed him to Chipping Cleghorn, where they shot him. The suitcase Walter St. John was carrying must have been the suitcase he left in Paddington Station, and then I suppose he sewed that cloakroom ticket into his coat on the bus ride from Paddington Station to Chipping Cleghorn, using some needle and thread he got from Mrs. Jacobs, the theatrical dresser. It's never stated explicitly, I'm just filling in the gaps here. But wait a minute, didn't we already open that suitcase and weren't there just some old clothes in there? Well, naturally, our Miss Marple pulled a switcheroo because she is the omniscient, omnipotent Dark Marple, and she knew that someone would try to lift that suitcase off Bunch once Bunch collected it at Paddington Station. The envelope that Miss Marple's former maid Gladys delivered to Miss Marple and Bunch was a second cloakroom ticket for Paddington Station. This is the ticket that Bunch handed in, which is why she was carrying a second suitcase packed by Gladys at Miss Marple's direction, the one holding the old speckled tweed with the beaver collar. I love that Miss Marple had thought through this ruse basically seconds after learning about the existence of the cloakroom ticket in Bunch's possession. Oh, I'm going to miss Miss Marple, our dear Aunt Jane. So that means the real suitcase has yet to be opened. So off to London go Inspector Craddock and Bunch. Bunch pretends she has a toothache and needs to see the dentist. And they visit Miss Marple, who I assume is still staying at dear Raymond and Joyce/Jones' flat. She hasn't opened up the suitcase yet. She's been waiting for them. Together, they open it up, and inside the real suitcase is Zobeida's old rhinestone costume. Or as Christie puts it, much more expressively, both women gave a slight gasp as the lid flew up. The sunlight coming through the window lit up what seemed like an inexhaustible treasure of sparkling jewels, red, blue, green, orange. Aladdin's cave, said Miss Marple. The flashing jewels the girl wore to dance. It seems that the clever Zobeida took the priceless emeralds from that necklace of hers and sewed them here and there among the costume jewelry making up the bulk of her costume. It was a replica of that emerald necklace that was stolen. The emeralds were safe all along, sitting with the trustworthy Mrs. Jacobs, who kept them safe for Zobeida and for Walter St. John, because guess what? Zobeida and Walter were married. Along with this costume in this suitcase are two official papers. The first is a marriage certificate between Walter Edmund St. John and Mary Moss, which was Zobeida's real name. I wonder if that means Edwin Moss was Zobeida's actual brother? I hope not. Maybe he was just using the name. But wait, there's more. The second official paper is a birth certificate for a girl named, wait for it, Jewel. And in a flash, pun intended, pun always intended, Bunch realizes that the long-lost daughter of the dead man and this dancer is Jill, a girl who the Mundys look after in Laburnum Cottage in Chipping Cleghorn. Is this the first time we've heard of the Mundys and of Jill? Unfortunately, yes. But apparently Mrs. Mundy had a stroke a week ago, and Mr. Mundy's been very ill with pneumonia. Bunch herself had been trying to find a good home for Jill so that the girl didn't get taken away to an institution. This information must have gotten back to Jewel/Jill's father in prison, who decided to break out of prison, even though his sentence was almost over, to ensure the emeralds came into his daughter's possession at a point in her life when she needed them so badly. And now, the dying man who had escaped from jail, who claimed sanctuary in the church at Chipping Cleghorn, which he was visiting to try to reach his long-lost daughter, the man who Bunch felt instinctively was a good man, will have his dying wish granted. Bunch is going to see to it personally. Here's how the story closes out. The following morning, Bunch took a fresh supply of chrysanthemums to the church. The sun was once more pouring through the east window, and Bunch stood in the jeweled light on the chancel steps. She said very softly under her breath, "Your little girl will be all right. I'll see that she is. I promise." Then she tidied up the church, slipped into a pew, and knelt for a few moments to say her prayers before returning to the vicarage to attack the piled-up chores of 2 neglected days. The end. Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
We don't have any adaptations of Sanctuary, unfortunately. I know the Hickson series didn't do any of the short stories, but I personally would have loved to see Joan Hickson's Miss Marple attacking the White Sails. I even would have loved to see Geraldine McEwen or Julia Mackenzie's Miss Marple attacking the White Sails. Given that Agatha Christie's Marple on ITV did adapt some of the short stories, I'm surprised they didn't choose this one. The story even includes a cameo by Tiglath-Pileser, Chipping Cleghorn's vicarage cat, who played such a key role in the solving of the mystery and a murder is announced. Alas, we'll have to wait a little longer, I suppose, for this Bunch Harmon-centric story to make its way to the screen. I feel like every Agatha Christie story will, at some point, be adapted, so I'm hopeful we'll all get to watch this one at some point. Especially because even though this isn't the most robust of mysteries, it's a lot of fun, and it's a great little character piece for Bunch in particular. It's one of those stories that meanders a bit, but sort of pulls together in the end, especially with that nice closing scene of Bunch in the church, which bookends so eloquently with the opening of the story. And how appropriate for a text written for the express purpose of refurbishing a beloved church. And really, what better way to end a Miss Marple short story than on this double note of religious faith and domesticity? I find it moving, but then maybe that's just because I'm feeling so emotionally fragile covering our very last Miss Marple story. However, I'm not feeling so fragile that I'm not willing to rip apart this story and point out a few glaring plot holes. Just 2 holes, actually. Why, oh why, didn't Christie mention the Mundys and Jill at the beginning of the story? We open the story from Bunch's point of view. It sounds like she was struggling with a lot when it came to what was happening with the Mundys and Jill. I think this could have been done so easily. Christie could have slipped in some vital information in the first paragraph or two that we could have used to solve the puzzle. We could have figured out that there was a person named Jewel and that this was the ward of the Mundys, et cetera, et cetera. It feels like a real missed opportunity. Also, and this isn't a whole, but I think it would have been a stronger story if we found out who Walter St. John was earlier on, because the mystery of why a man whose prison sentence is almost over would choose to escape from prison and then get shot soon after he escapes is a really good mystery. If she had revealed that earlier, I think she could have made a lot more of that. The second plot hole has to do with what exactly Mr. Eccles and Mr. Moss's plan was. In the end, we're not even sure who it was who shot Walter St. John. Inspector Craddock says that the revolver used was Mr. Eccles's, and he thinks that it was Mr. Moss who did the shooting. But we don't have any definitive information. And if Mr. Eccles and Mr. Moss went to the trouble of trailing Walter and then shooting him, surely they wouldn't have been stopped by the notion of sanctuary from following Walter into the church, and at the very least rooting around for the cloakroom ticket they knew he had. I suppose maybe Walter was able to get away from them, to give them the slip, and then simply hide in the church, seeking sanctuary in a more general way due to the fact that he had escaped from prison. I just wish we'd gotten a better sense of how matters played out down in Chipping Cleghorn once Walter St. John arrived there. I would have liked a clearer picture of the moment leading up to and swiftly following his shooting. But these are quibbles, and I'd hate to end my final sojourn in the Marpleverse on a quibble. So my final thought is that I think it's wonderfully appropriate, poetic even, that for our final Miss Marple story together, we have a story where the interstitial matter, the in-between parts, are the best parts of the story. And to be clear, that is not a dig at this short story. It's not the most scintillating of mysteries. It's not even really a functional puzzle. But I love Bunch, and I love her relationship with Julian, and I love everything Miss Marple says here, and the way that she esteems her favorite godchild, Bunch. And I find, as I look back on the many years now that I've spent delighting in Miss Marple, that it really is the character who is responsible for my overwhelming love of the Miss Marple mysteries. Sure, the Miss Marple novels are clever, and they tend to be extremely well written and even well crafted, even if they rely on some pretty outlandish and convenient traps at the end in place of cold hard evidence. But it's Miss Marple herself who came from the very bosom of Christie's family, from her Auntie Granny, and especially as Miss Marple grew older, from Christie herself. Miss Marple is the reason I love these stories as much as I do. And as slight and as spoon-fed as the mystery in Sanctuary is, we do get a full and final glimpse here of our dear Aunt Jane. And that is as priceless to me as an emerald necklace, or, say, a mountain of marron glacé. I'd also just like to remind you all of our true last look at Miss Marple, which occurs at the end of Nemesis, when she's solved yet another case, and she leaves triumphant with her hard-earned winnings. And this is our final image of her. She looked back from the door and she laughed. Just for one moment, Mr. Schuster, who was a man of more imagination than Mr. Broadrib, had a vague impression of a young and pretty girl shaking hands with the vicar at a garden party in the country. It was, as he realized a moment later, a recollection of his own youth. But Miss Marple had, for a minute, reminded him of that particular girl. Young, happy, going to enjoy herself. That is our true final look at Miss Marple. Sleeping murder notwithstanding, and it couldn't be a more different farewell from the one we get for Poirot in Curtain, because it isn't really an ending at all. Miss Marple never dies, and even though we know that's impossible, even though we know that Agatha Christie died, and my beloved former co-host Catherine Brobeck died, and that one day you'll die, and I'll die, it's nice to think that even where death is concerned, Miss Marple reigns supreme. So whether you believe she's simply a brilliant old lady, or you believe in Catherine's dark Marple theory, I believe both, if I'm being honest, I find it truly comforting to imagine that the world will never be without Miss Jane Marple. That is Sanctuary by Agatha Christie. We have now covered every single Miss Marple story Agatha Christie ever wrote. I feel complete, I feel whole, not empty, and I hope you all feel the same. For my next episode, I am going to be doing something rather different. I am so excited to bring this episode to you. I will be talking all about ableism in Agatha Christie's texts. This is an issue Catherine and I touched on from time to time, but not nearly enough on the podcast. I have been eager to address this topic for some time now, and I will have 3 co-hosts with me who will be sharing their perspectives. These 3 co-hosts are all members of the disabled community themselves, so their perspective is invaluable. And this is going to be an episode where I do as little talking as possible because my perspective on this topic has already been shared several times and is nowhere near as valuable as theirs since I am not a member of the disabled community. And I'm so grateful they agreed to come on and share their thoughts and views and scholarly analysis of Christie. Their names are Tina Hodgkinson, Jenny Bishop, and Emma, and they are all brilliant. I will be telling you a lot more about them at the top of my next episode. So that will be in 2 weeks' time. You can, of course, always head on over to the podcast's Patreon page, www.patreon.com, patreon.com/allaboutagatha, or just click the link in the show notes. I just posted an episode discussing The Burden by Mary Westmacott, the final Mary Westmacott. Published right around the same time as Sanctuary, actually, published in 1956. I'm finding myself steeped in 50s Christie lately, and I'm loving it. You can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com, and who knows, maybe your email will be featured in a future housekeeping segment. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame, and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And please, please, please take a moment to give the podcast a rating and or a review if you haven't yet done so. It really helps me out. Just because the podcast has been on for a long time does not mean we don't need those ratings and reviews, so keep them coming. All right, see you soon. Bye.
Fill your summer with the sun-kissed sweetness of Amigos Refreshers. There's strawberry acai, blueberry dragon fruit, and mango passion fruit, each a tropical delight. So skip the hot coffee and amp up your day with the plant-based natural caffeine and fruity flavor fusions in an Amigos Refresher. These cool thirst quenchers are just $3.99, or there's a mega 32-ounce size for $4.99. Recharge with the bold, fresh flavor of an energizing refresher at Amigos.
If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.